There was exactly one rule at the Castellan estate that had never once been broken in 19 years, and Camille Broussard broke it on a Tuesday afternoon in April, in front of 11 men who ran roughly a third of the cargo moving through the port of New Orleans. The rule was simple, and every member of the household staff had it explained to them on their very first day in the same flat, careful tone the estate manager used for nothing else. Family members of staff, do not approach Mr. Castellan directly. Not in the kitchen. Not on the grounds. Not ever, for any reason, under any circumstance, without being summoned first. Cammy had grown up 200 yards from that rule her entire life and had never once tested it, not when she'd skinned her knee running past the old carriage house at 8, not when she'd graduated nursing prerequisites at 19 with nobody from the big house present to see it, not through 19 years of watching her mother disappear through the service entrance every morning at 6 and come back every evening smelling of lemon oil and somebody else's enormous, quiet house. She broke it that Tuesday because her mother had collapsed on the kitchen floor of that enormous, quiet house 40 minutes earlier, and the ambulance the estate had called was already loading Odette Broussard onto a gurney, and nobody, not the estate manager, not the paramedics, not a single one of the 11 important men currently finishing lunch in the West dining room, could tell Cammy whether her mother's heart was going to keep beating long enough to reach the hospital, let alone whether anyone besides Cammy herself was going to find a way to pay for whatever came after. She went through the front of the house instead of the service entrance for the first time in her life. She didn't knock. She pushed through the tall doors of the dining room with her uniform scrub still half-buttoned from her own shift across town, and 11 heads turned toward her at once, and the room with the particular kind of silent that happens when something has occurred that isn't supposed to be possible. Julien Castellan sat at the head of the table, a folder of shipping contracts open in front of him, mid-sentence. He was 36 years old, and he had inherited the business and the parts of it nobody said out loud from his father 12 years earlier, and in 12 years, no one from the domestic staff had ever once interrupted a meeting in that room. Mr. Castellan. Cammy's voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. My mother just collapsed in your kitchen. She's being taken to Truro right now, and nobody in this house can tell me if the ambulance called ahead, and I need to know if somebody is actually going to help her, because I don't have the money to make sure they do. One of the men at the table, older, silver-templed, seated at Julien's right hand, rose halfway out of his chair with the particular speed of a man used to solving problems before they finished forming. I'll have security escort her out, he said, already moving. No. Julien didn't raise his voice. He simply set his pen down flat on the folder in front of him, the way a man sets something aside when he has decided, in that instant, that it no longer matters as much as whatever just walked through the door. Sit down, Gideon. The silver-templed man, Gideon Marsh, though Cammy didn't yet know his name, sat back down slowly, his eyes not leaving her. Julien rose instead, buttoned his jacket, and crossed the length of the long table without hurrying, the way a man walks when he has decided that whatever is happening now is the only thing in the room that still matters. What hospital? He said. Not a question, exactly. A door opening. Truro. Who's your mother? Odette. Odette Broussard. She's worked in this house 19 years. And I don't think a single one of you has ever once asked her last name until right now. Something moved across Julien Castellan's face that none of the 11 men in that room, men who had watched him negotiate cargo contracts worth more than most of their houses without so much as a change in expression had ever seen there before. "Get my car around front," he said to no one in particular, already walking. Now, behind him, Gideon Marsh had not moved from his chair, though his eyes tracked Julien's exit with an intensity none of the other 10 men at the table noticed, or would have thought to read as anything other than a security chief's habitual watchfulness. He alone in that room understood immediately what the name Broussard might eventually mean if anyone started asking the wrong questions in the wrong order, and he alone spent the remainder of that lunch in careful, silent calculation, while the other 10 men returned, awkwardly, to a conversation about freight tariffs that none of them could quite finish with any real attention. Cammy didn't notice him at all. She was already moving toward the door, Julien half a step behind her, and the enormous, quiet house she had spent her entire life on the edge of was, for the first time, simply a hallway she needed to get through as fast as possible. Asterisk if stories about a rule broken for the right reason about the exact moment a small act of desperation changes something much bigger than one family means something to you. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Asterisk. Now let's step back 3 weeks to be exact to understand how a maid's daughter and a shipping empire's heir came to be standing in the same room at all. The Broussard house sat 2 streets back from the edge of the Castellan property, a shotgun house with a tin roof that rang like a drum when it rained, which in New Orleans was often. Cammy had grown up counting the storms by how many buckets her mother set out under the worst leaks, and she had grown up, too, understanding long before she had the words for it, that the enormous, quiet house at the end of Belchase Lane belonged to a different kind of life than hers, one she could walk right up to the edge of and never actually enter. Odette Broussard had worked as head housekeeper for the Castellan family for 19 years, since Cammy was 1 year old, since a winter so hard on the family finances that Odette had taken the position without asking too many questions about the family's other business, the shipping company that was, by public reputation, entirely legitimate, and by every other kind of reputation, something people in the Ninth Ward knew to speak about carefully, if at all. She'd raised Cammy on a housekeeper's salary, on double shifts during Mardi Gras season when the Castellans hosted half the city, on a particular kind of tired that Cammy only fully understood once she started her own nursing rotations and came home some nights barely able to stand. She was 20 years old now, a year into her nursing program at Delgado, working part-time at an urgent care clinic in Gentilly to help cover what her scholarship didn't, and she had never once, in 20 years, walked through the front doors of the house her mother had spent nearly her entire adult life cleaning. The neighborhood around Belchase Lane had its own careful etiquette about the estate, one Cammy had absorbed the way children absorb most important rules, without ever being formally taught it, simply by watching how the adults around her behaved. You didn't linger at the gate. You didn't ask the household staff too many questions about what happened inside, even when curiosity got the better of you, which it often did among the neighborhood kids, half of whom had a parent or grandparent who'd worked the docks at some point in the family's long history in the port. There was a kind of shared, unspoken agreement that the Castellans' business was the Castellans' business, and that the safest, most sensible way to live 2 streets from that much money and that much quiet danger was to stay pleasant, stay useful, and never, under any circumstances, get curious about the parts that didn't concern you directly. Cammy had grown up entirely inside that agreement without ever once questioning it, right up until the afternoon her mother's heart stopped. Working properly on someone else's kitchen floor, and the agreement suddenly seemed like exactly the kind of thing a person in her position could no longer afford to honor. What Cammy had never fully understood, what she had asked about exactly twice in her life and been gently, firmly redirected both times, was her father. Etienne Broussard had died when Cammy was 1 year old, in what the single sentence her mother ever offered described as an accident down at the docks. There was no funeral photograph on the mantel, though. There was, tucked in a drawer Cammy had found once by accident at age 11, a single faded picture of a young man laughing at something. Outside the frame, his arms slung around a much younger version of her mother's shoulders. He worked the docks, Odette would say, on the rare occasions the subject came up at all, in a voice that closed the conversation the way a door closes. It was a long time ago, baby. Let it stay there. Cammy had let it stay there for 20 years, mostly because her mother asked her to, and partly because there had never been anything concrete enough to pull at. No name, no company, no date beyond a long time ago, nothing except a photograph and a closed door and a mother whose face went somewhere far away for exactly as long as it took to change the subject. That would change on a Tuesday in April, though not in any way either of them could have predicted 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when Cammy had walked over to the estate's edge to bring her mother a forgotten umbrella and had seen, for the first time in her life, the man everyone in the neighborhood called, in lowered voices, simply Castellan. Julien Castellan had inherited Castellan maritime and trade from his father, Marcus, 12 years earlier, at 24, under circumstances he did not discuss and almost no one outside the family fully understood. What the Port of New Orleans understood was simpler. Castellan Maritime moved more container freight through the port than any other privately held company on the Gulf Coast, employed several thousand people directly and several thousand more indirectly, and had, for 2 generations, operated with a public face of civic generosity, hospital wings, scholarship funds, a genuinely beloved Mardi Gras crew, and a private undercurrent that everyone in certain circles understood, without ever needing it spelled out. Marcus Castellan had built the private undercurrent. Julien had spent 12 years trying, in ways he rarely discussed even with himself, to quietly narrow it deal by deal, contract by contract, a slow unwinding of the parts of the business that couldn't survive full daylight, done carefully enough that the men who depended on the old arrangements never fully noticed how much ground they'd lost until it was already gone. He was 36, unmarried, and privately regarded by most of the household staff as fair, if distant, a man who paid well. Noticed almost nothing about the people who kept his house running and carried, underneath a controlled and unreadable public manner, a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with how much sleep he was getting. Cammy saw him for the first time 3 weeks before the dining room incident, on a Sunday afternoon, standing at the edge of the estate's long lawn in shirt sleeves alone, looking out toward the bayou with an expression she had no name for yet and would only understand much later. The particular stillness of a man standing in the middle of everything he owns and feeling almost none of it. She hadn't spoken to him. She'd been 16 feet away, delivering her mother's forgotten umbrella to the service gate, and he had looked over once, briefly, the way you look at any unfamiliar face crossing the edge of your property, and then looked back out at the water without any particular curiosity. She hadn't thought about it again until 3 weeks later, standing in his dining room with her mother's life hanging somewhere between the kitchen floor and an ambulance, and the same man had crossed an entire room full of dangerous, important people without hesitating because a housekeeper's daughter had said her mother's name out loud. What Cammy didn't know yet, what almost no one outside the family's inner circle knew, was that Julien had spent the better part of a decade quietly rebuilding his own understanding of what the Castellan name was supposed to mean. His father had raised him to believe that loyalty flowed in exactly one direction, down from the family to whoever served it, never the reverse, and never questioned. Julien had accepted that framework for most of his 20s, running the business his father built with the same careful, closed-off competence Marcus had modeled for him his entire childhood. Somewhere in his early 30s, he could not have named the exact moment even to himself, that framework had started to feel less like inheritance and more like a debt he had never agreed to take on. He had begun making small, largely unannounced changes, quietly declining the kind of contracts his father would have accepted without a second thought, extending health coverage to dock workers whose predecessors had never had any, funding a scholarship program through the family's charitable foundation that he privately hoped someday might partially answer for whatever his father's era of the business had actually cost. He had never fully articulated to himself what that cost might have specifically been. He simply carried a persistent, unexamined sense that there was a debt somewhere in his family's ledger that had never been properly accounted for, and he had spent a decade trying to pay down its general shape without ever locating its precise origin. He was about to find it. To understand what Odette Broussard carried into that kitchen every morning for 19 years, you have to go back further than Cammy knew to go back to a night in late October, 21 years ago, on a loading dock at the port of New Orleans, when a 26-year-old longshoreman named Etienne Broussard saw something he was never supposed to see. Etienne worked nights on the Castellan docks, and on that particular night, running late to clock out, he'd walked past an open container bay he wasn't scheduled to be near and witnessed, for perhaps 11 seconds, an exchange between two men he recognized and one crate that should not have existed on any manifest he'd ever loaded. He never told anyone what he saw. He didn't need to. Marcus Castellan's head of security at the time, a careful, methodical man named Gideon Marsh, 31 years old then, newly promoted, eager to prove himself indispensable, noticed the 11 seconds on a security camera Etienne hadn't known existed, and made a judgment that night that would define the next 2 decades of several people's lives. Etienne Broussard died 6 days later in what the official report called a crane accident. Odette, 24 years old and 5 months pregnant, was told by a man she would only ever remember as soft-spoken and terrifyingly calm that her husband's death had been a tragedy, that the company would, out of compassion, offer her a permanent position in the Castellan household with full benefits and a modest monthly stipend for the child she was carrying, and that it would be wisest for everyone, but especially for the baby, if she never asked questions about the docks again. She had understood, without ever being told outright, exactly what kind of offer that was, and exactly what would happen if she declined it, or if she ever spoke a word of what she suspected to anyone at all. She took the position. She raised her daughter 2 streets from the house of the man whose company had killed her husband, and she did it for 19 years without once letting her face show what it cost her, because the alternative, the only alternative she could see, with a baby on the way and a threat she understood perfectly even though it had never been spoken plainly, was worse. There had been, in the earliest years, small reminders, never a Direct threat. Never anything a lawyer could have pointed to, only a pattern. Odette learned to read the way she learned to read weather. Gideon would ask, once or twice a year, with perfect courtesy, how young Camille was getting on in school. He would mention, in passing, some detail about the family's ongoing generosity that made clear, without ever making it explicit, exactly how conditional that generosity actually was. She understood the arrangement completely within the first year, and she never once tested its boundaries again. Not for 19 years, not even when curiosity or grief or simple exhaustion made her want to. Gideon Marsh had never once mentioned it again in 19 years. He also never once, in 19 years, entirely stopped watching her. Odette had built an entire life around a single unbroken silence, and she had done it so completely that her own daughter, 20 years later, still believed her father had died in an accident nobody was responsible for. 2 days after the dining room, with Odette stable but resting under observation at Touro and the hospital's finance office already calling about a cardiac procedure Cammy had no idea how her mother would ever afford. Cammy let herself into her mother's house to grab a change of clothes and found herself, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, afterward, standing in front of the old metal toolbox in the hall closet that had sat there, untouched as far as she knew, her entire life. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She told herself that several times while she was doing it. Underneath a layer of mismatched hardware and a coil of picture wire, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag gone brittle with age, she found a manila envelope. Inside it, the same faded photograph she'd found once. At 11, her father laughing, her mother young and unguarded beside him, and beneath that, folded small, a laminated union identification card in the name Etienne J. Broussard, Local 1418, Port of New Orleans, and a single newspaper clipping, brittle and yellowed, dated 21 years earlier, 3 paragraphs long, reporting the death of a 26-year-old dockworker in an equipment malfunction at the Castellan Maritime Container Terminal. Cammy read the clipping 4 times. There was nothing dramatic in it. No accusation, no hint of anything beyond an ordinary industrial accident, the kind that happened, tragically, sometimes at working ports. What stopped her wasn't the clipping. It was the date. Her mother had always told her, the 2 times the subject had ever come up at all, that Etienne died a long time ago, which Cammy had always understood, without ever quite examining the assumption, to mean sometime before she could remember, back when she was a newborn, unconnected to anything happening in her own conscious life. The clipping's date placed his death 6 days before Cammy's own first birthday, a fact her mother had never once mentioned in an entire lifetime of careful, gentle deflection, and a fact that meant Cammy had spent every birthday of her life, every single one, on or near the anniversary of the day her father died, without her mother ever once telling her that the 2 dates sat side by side. She sat on the floor of the hall closet for a long time with the envelope in her lap, feeling, for the first time in her life, the particular vertigo of realizing that a story she had accepted without question for 20 years might not be the whole story at all, and having absolutely no idea, yet, how far the real one actually went, or whose enormous, quiet house it might eventually lead her back to. She thought, sitting there, about every small deflection her mother had ever offered on the subject, not just the words themselves, but the particular timing of them, always arriving a beat too quickly, always closing the conversation before Cammy had finished asking whatever question had prompted it. She thought about the fact that her mother had taken a position at the Castellan estate within months of Etienne's death, a detail Camille had simply absorbed as ordinary practical necessity her entire life and had never once examined as a choice that might have required an explanation. She thought about 19 years of watching her mother walk through that service gate every morning with her shoulders set in exactly the same careful, composed way, and wondered, for the first time, whether some of that composure had never actually been about the work at all. She put the envelope back exactly where she'd found it, underneath the picture wire, beneath the mismatched hardware, and she told herself on the drive back to the hospital that she would ask her mother directly. Plainly, the next time Odette was strong enough for the conversation. She did not yet know that the question would end up finding its own way to the surface long before she worked up the courage to ask it herself. Gideon Marsh was 53 years old, and in 22 years as head of security for Castellan Maritime and Trade, he had made himself indispensable in the particular way that only comes from knowing exactly where every body, figurative and, in one case, literal, was buried. He had served Marcus Castellan first, then Julien, with the same unbroken, careful competence, the kind that made him nearly invisible at every family dinner and completely essential to every decision that mattered. He arranged security details. He vetted new hires. He managed, quietly and without fuss, the handful of arrangements from the company's old undercurrent that Julien hadn't yet found a way to unwind, and he had, for 21 years, managed one particular arrangement more carefully than any other, the continued, complete silence of a widow named Odette Broussard. He told himself, and had told himself for 2 decades, that what he'd done that October night had been a kindness, in its own brutal way, a quick decision that had prevented a much longer, much bloodier reckoning that Marcus Castellan would otherwise have ordered personally. Once he learned a dock worker had witnessed the exchange. Gideon had acted first, alone, without instruction, precisely so that Marcus never had to. He had, in the only language his world recognized, taken the weight of the entire matter onto himself, and he had carried it without complaint for 21 years, certain that his silence and Odette's had bought a kind of peace that a different decision that night would never have allowed. He did not think of himself as a murderer. He thought of himself as a man who had made one irreversible choice under impossible pressure and had spent every day since trying, in his own way, to make sure it never had to happen again. What he had not accounted for, in 21 years of careful watching, was a girl walking into a dining room and saying her mother's full name out loud in front of 11 men, and Julien Castellan crossing the length of that room without hesitating. Gideon had watched Julien's face in that moment more closely than anyone else in the room, and what he'd seen there had unsettled him far more than the interruption itself. Not annoyance, not the mild concern of an employer whose household had been disrupted, but something closer to recognition, as if some small, buried part of Julien had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly that door to open. Gideon Marsh had spent 21 years making absolutely certain that doors stayed closed. He did not intend to let one desperate afternoon undo it now. He had built, over those 2 decades, an entire private philosophy around what he had done, not quite a justification, since some part of him had never fully believed the justification even as he constructed it, but a kind of scaffolding sturdy enough to let him keep functioning. That the family's survival had required one terrible, necessary act, and that a man willing to carry that act alone, without ever asking for absolution or even acknowledgement, was performing a kind of loyalty, more real than any of the polite, comfortable loyalty offered by men who had never once been asked to do anything difficult on the family's behalf. He told himself this on the drive home most evenings. He had told himself this for so long that the telling itself had become a kind of ritual, worn smooth with repetition, the way a stone in a river eventually stops looking like it was ever anything but round. What he had never once allowed himself to examine in 21 years of careful scaffolding was the shape of the widow's face the single time he had delivered his original offer to her, the particular, complete stillness of a young woman doing the exact same arithmetic he was doing, arriving independently at the same terrible conclusion and choosing, for the sake of the child she was carrying, to let him believe she had simply accepted his kindness rather than fully understood his threat. Julien Castellan paid for his mother's for Odette's cardiac procedure in full, quietly, before Cammy had finished filling out the first round of hospital paperwork. He didn't mention it to her directly. She learned about it from a financial counselor at Turo who assumed she already knew and who looked faintly confused when Cammy's face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something between gratitude and suspicion. She found Julien 3 days later, not by breaking any rules this time, but through the estate manager, who, visibly startled to be asked, arranged a short meeting in the estate's front sitting room, a room Cammy had dusted exactly twice in her life while covering shifts for her mother, and had never once been permitted to sit down in. "I don't know how to pay you back," she said, sitting stiffly on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than her mother's entire kitchen. "I need you to know that's not why I came in here that day. I wasn't asking for money. I didn't even think about money until later." "I know," Julien said. "That's exactly why I paid it." She studied him for a moment, trying to find the edge of whatever arrangement this was supposed to become, the string she'd been raised implicitly to expect from men like him. "There's no version of this where you don't want something eventually." There might not be, he admitted, which surprised her more than a denial would have. "I've spent 12 years learning that almost nothing I do is entirely clean. But I can tell you honestly, this particular thing I did because a young woman stood in the middle of my dining room and told the truth to 11 men who mostly don't hear it anymore. I don't get that very often. I wanted to reward it, not attach a leash to it." It was, Cammy would think much later, the first entirely honest sentence a Castellan had ever said directly to a Broussard, though neither of them yet understood the full weight the word honest was about to carry between their two families. There was, over those first several weeks, an odd, careful courtesy between them, the kind that develops naturally between two people who each understand, without needing to discuss it, that the other one holds a piece of power the other doesn't fully have. Julien was scrupulously careful never to make Cammy feel obligated. Cammy was equally careful never to let herself lean on his generosity more than the actual work she was doing justified, insisting more than once that her hourly rate for the archive work match exactly what the estate paid any other outside contractor, no more. "You don't have to keep proving you're not after anything," Julien told her once, midway through the 5th week, watching her decline, for the second time, an offer to have the estate cover her nursing school textbooks outright. "I already know that." "Maybe I'm proving it to myself," she said, "not to you." He'd thought about that answer for longer than he expected to, recognizing in it something of his own decade-long project of quietly proving, to no one but himself, that he was not simply his father's son. Over the following weeks, an arrangement took shape that neither of them had planned. Cammy, needing to be near the hospital and near her mother's convalescence, began picking up small paid tasks around the estate on her days off from the clinic, cataloging an old library, helping the estate manager digitize decades of paper records nobody had touched since Marcus Castellan's death. It was Julien's idea, offered almost sideways, without ceremony, and Cammy had taken it for the same reason she'd broken the house's oldest rule 3 weeks earlier. Because she needed to, and because for the first time in her life, someone from that enormous, quiet house had actually asked what she needed instead of assuming they already knew. The private archive room on the 3rd floor of the Castellan house had not been properly organized since Marcus Castellan's death 12 years earlier, filing cabinets of shipping manifests, personnel records, and decades of company correspondence, all of it technically Julien's responsibility and none of it, until now, anyone's actual priority. Cammy spent 3 afternoons a week in that room through most of May, sorting decades of paper into something resembling order, and it was on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, reaching for a box of old personnel files from the shipping terminal's early years that she found a slim folder near the back of a drawer labeled, in faded handwriting she didn't recognize, Incident Reports, Terminal 4. Most of the folder was routine, injury reports, equipment failures. The ordinary paper trail of a working port across several decades. Near the bottom, dated 21 years earlier, was a single page that made her hands go still, an internal memorandum, 3 sentences long, referencing the E. Broussard matter, describing it only as resolved per standard protocol, and signed with a single set of initials. GM. There was no explanation of what the matter had been. There was no further detail at all. But the name, the date, and the flat, careful phrasing of resolved per standard protocol sat in Cammy's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she didn't yet have the tools to read. She didn't show it to Julien that day. She told herself she needed to understand more first, that a single ambiguous memo proved nothing, that jumping to the darkest possible conclusion about the family whose house she was now, cautiously, allowing herself to feel welcome in would be both unfair and possibly dangerous. She folded the page carefully and tucked it into her bag instead, and she began, quietly, over the following days, asking her mother gentle, sideways questions about the docs, about the years before Cammy was born, about a man named GM whose initials she recognized now every time she passed the estate's head of security in a hallway. Odette answered every question the same way she always had, carefully, briefly, with a closed door in her voice, but Cammy had spent 20 years learning to read the particular quality of her mother's silences, and this one, for the first time, felt less like grief and more like fear. She began, quietly, spending her evenings after clinic shifts searching old newspaper archives at the public library on Loyola Avenue Cross, referencing the date on her father's clipping against Port Authority records, union newsletters, anything the library's limited digitized collection could offer. Most of what she found was maddeningly thin. A working port's routine paper trail, injury statistics, the ordinary churn of an industry that rarely made headlines unless something went badly, publicly wrong. But she found, eventually, a single archived union newsletter from the month after Etienne's death, 3 paragraphs long, that described his death in language subtly different from the newspaper clipping her mother had kept, language that hinted, without quite saying it outright, that several of his co-workers had privately doubted the official account, and that at least one had raised the question with union leadership before, as the newsletter delicately put. The matter was not pursued further. She read that sentence more times than she could count. The matter was not pursued further. It was the second time in a week she had encountered that exact particular shape of language, careful, bloodless, designed to close a door rather than open one, and she was beginning, slowly, to understand that both doors led to the same room. Gideon Marsh noticed the missing incident folder within a week. He had, over 21 years, developed a habit, never discussed with anyone, never formalized in any procedure, of periodically checking that particular drawer, the way a man checks a wound that healed a long time ago but never quite stopped aching. He noticed its absence on a Tuesday, and he noticed, the same afternoon, that the young woman doing archive work on the third floor had started asking the household staff unusually specific questions about how long certain employees had worked for the family and whether anyone remembered a dock worker named Broussard from more than 20 years back. He did not confront her. Gideon Marsh had not survived 22 years at the right hand of two different Castellan patriarchs by acting on impulse. He watched instead, carefully, the way he had watched Odette for 2 decades, weighing exactly how much danger a single missing page actually represented. The honest answer, which he turned over in his mind for several sleepless nights, was potentially everything. Not because Camille Broussard could prove anything in a court of law from a 3-sentence memo with his initials on it. She couldn't, not on its own, but because Julien Castellan had begun, in the weeks since the dining room incident, doing something Gideon had spent 12 years quietly discouraging, asking questions about his father's era of the business that he had never asked before. Small questions. Old contracts he wanted explained. A growing, restless curiosity that Gideon recognized with a cold certainty as the particular kind of curiosity that eventually finds everything, given enough time and enough motivation. And Camille Broussard, whether she fully understood it yet or not, had become exactly the kind of motivation Julien had never had before. Gideon began, carefully, to prepare for a possibility he had hoped for 21 years he would never have to face again. That silence alone was no longer going to be enough to keep the past exactly where he had buried it. He considered, in the privacy of his own methodical mind, several options over those difficult weeks and discarded most of them almost as quickly as he generated them. He considered simply resigning, quietly disappearing from the family's life entirely before anyone could connect the initials on an old memo to the man who'd signed it, and rejected it within a day, understanding that a sudden, unexplained departure after 22 years would raise exactly the kind of questions he most needed to avoid. He considered, briefly and with a self-disgust he did not examine too closely, whether there existed some version of removing the threat entirely that wouldn't cost him everything he had spent 2 decades protecting, and set that thought aside each time it surfaced, telling himself it was not yet necessary, that a conversation, carefully handled, would still be enough to contain whatever Camille Broussard thought she had found. He was, in this particular calculation, wrong, though it would take him several more weeks of careful, mounting anxiety to fully understand exactly how wrong, and by then, the conversation he still believed would be enough was no longer the only option left available to him. It was Julien, in the end, who first said the sentence that started everything moving toward its reckoning, not because he suspected anything specific, but because he had, over 2 months, become genuinely fond of a woman he'd known his entire life only as the housekeeper, and fondness, he was discovering, tended to produce curiosity he'd never previously bothered with. He found Odette one evening in the estate's kitchen garden, recovering. Well, moving slowly but steadily among the herb beds she'd tended for 19 years, and he asked her, gently, almost as an afterthought, about her husband, Cammie's father, a man Julien realized with faint embarrassment he had never once heard mentioned in 12 years of running a household this woman had quietly kept running underneath him. He worked the docks, Odette said, the same 3 words she'd given her daughter for 20 years, and Julien, watching her face carefully, for the first time in his life, noticed something he had never had reason to notice before, the particular stillness of a person choosing, in real time, exactly how much of the truth to hand over. What happened to him? An accident, Mr. Castellan. Her voice was even. Her hands, pruning a stem of rosemary, did not shake. A long time ago. Julien nodded and let the subject go, the way a careful man lets things go when he senses, without being able to name it yet, that pushing further would cost more than he currently understood the price to be. But he carried the exchange with him afterward in a way he hadn't expected to, turning it over the same night in his father's old study, a room he rarely entered, full of records he had always assumed were simply the ordinary weight of an old company's history, and for the first time in 12 years, he found himself wondering with a discomfort he couldn't quite place exactly how many of his father's old arrangements he had never bothered to look at closely enough to understand. He did not yet know that a folded incident report was sitting at that exact moment in a canvas bag in Cammie Broussard's small apartment across town, or that the initials on it belonged to the man standing guard, as he always did, at the edge of every important room in Julien's life. He only knew, sitting alone in his father's study with the lamp burning low, that something in the quiet architecture of his own household had shifted, and that he was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely afraid of what he might find if he finally looked at it directly. He thought, that night, about every conversation he had ever had with Gideon about the estate's older history, how consistently, over 12 years, Gideon had steered those conversations toward the practical and away from the personal, how thoroughly Julien had come to rely on Gideon's version of events as simply the accurate record of a period he himself was too young to remember firsthand. He had never once in 12 years questioned why a security chief would be the family's primary historian. He questioned it now, sitting in the lamplight, and found that once the question had occurred to him, he could not unthink it, could not go back to the comfortable, unexamined trust that had let him run this household for over a decade without ever once looking underneath its foundations. He decided, before he finally went to bed that night, that he would ask Gideon directly the next morning what he remembered about a dock worker named Broussard. He would not get the chance. By the time morning came, the question had already, without his knowledge, begun answering itself in a kitchen across town. Gideon Marsh made his decision on a Sunday night, alone in his office on the estate's ground floor, after watching, through the window, Cammie Broussard's car parked outside the archive room for the 3rd evening in a row, long after her paid hours should have ended. He had spent 2 weeks weighing every option available to a careful man, and he had concluded, with the same cold arithmetic that had governed the worst night of his life 21 years earlier, that there was only one path left that guaranteed his silence held. He needed the incident report back, and he needed Cammie Broussard to understand, in terms unambiguous enough that a 20-year-old nursing student would never mistake them for anything else, that whatever she thought she had found was not a door she wanted to keep pushing on. He did not intend violence. He told himself that, repeatedly as he drove to the small apartment building in Gentilly where Cammy lived with two roommates, both of whom he had confirmed through a week of quiet watching were away that weekend. The drive took him past the old Terminal 4 loading docks, dark and quiet at that hour, and he found himself, without quite meaning to, slowing the car as he passed, looking out at the exact stretch of concrete where he had once stood 11 seconds worth of decision away from an entirely different life. He had driven past that stretch of dock thousands of times in 21 years. He had rarely allowed himself to actually look at it. He looked at it now, and something in his careful, methodical composure shifted in a way he did not have time to fully examine before he arrived at Cammy's building, parked, and let himself in through a service door he had, out of long habit, already identified as unmonitored. He intended, he told himself, only a conversation, the kind of conversation that had kept an entire secret buried for 2 decades, through nothing more than careful, controlled pressure. What actually happened, once he was standing in her small kitchen with the door locked behind him and Cammy backed against the counter, her phone already knocked from her hand and sliding under the refrigerator, was something closer to what he had always privately feared himself capable of and had spent 21 years trying not to become again. "I know you took the file," he said, his voice as even and soft-spoken as it had always been, the same voice Odette had described to no one in 21 years. "I need it back, Camille. Tonight. And I need you to understand that whatever you think you're building toward with Mr. Castellan, whatever comfortable little friendship you imagine you're growing into, it ends the moment you say one more word about your father to anyone in that house. You killed him." Cammy's voice shook, but she didn't look away from him. The same steadiness that had carried her across a dining room 8 weeks earlier, rising up now in a much smaller, much more dangerous room. "That's what the file says, isn't it? Resolved per standard protocol. That's what you call it." Something in Gideon's controlled face cracked, just slightly, not guilt exactly, but the particular strain of a man who had spent 21 years believing his own careful justification and was hearing it, for the first time, spoken back to him in someone else's mouth as exactly what it actually was. "I saved this family from a war that night," he said. "Your father saw something he was never meant to see. I made a decision no one else was willing to make, and I have carried it alone for 2 decades so that Marcus Castellan never had to give an order that would have cost this family everything. Your mother has lived comfortably for 19 years because of a choice I made to protect her, whether either of you has ever understood that or not. You call what you did to her protection?" He didn't answer that. He crossed the small kitchen instead, and for one long moment, Cammy genuinely did not know what was about to happen to her, standing alone in a locked apartment with a man who had killed her father and kept the truth buried for longer than she had been alive. What saved her was the same thing that had started everything 8 weeks earlier. She had never, in her entire life, learned how to stay quiet when it mattered most. She screamed, not for help exactly, simply because it was the only weapon she had left, loudly enough that the elderly neighbor 2 doors down, a retired postal worker with a lifelong habit of calling the police at the first hint of trouble, picked up his phone before Gideon had finished crossing the room. He left 10 minutes later, without the file, without the conversation he'd planned, having accomplished nothing except confirming, in the worst possible way, exactly how much danger he now represented. And Cammy, shaking, bruised at the wrist where he'd gripped her, did not call the police that night because the only person she trusted enough to call with the full, impossible truth was a man 2 streets away in an enormous, quiet house who had crossed a room full of dangerous people, once all ready for her family's sake. Julien arrived at Cammie's apartment at 11 that night, having broken several of his own speed records getting across town, and found her sitting upright at her kitchen table, unhurt beyond a bruise already. Darkening at her wrist, a folded piece of paper laid flat in front of her like evidence at a trial she had never expected to be part of. He read the incident report twice. He read it a third time out loud, slowly, as if hearing his own voice say the words might make them easier to fully absorb. "This isn't proof of anything," he said finally, and Cammie watched him say it the way a man says something he desperately wants to be true and already suspects isn't. "This is 3 sentences and a set of initials. It could mean 100 things." "Ask him," Cammie said quietly. "Ask Gideon what it means. See what his face does." Julien didn't sleep that night. He went, instead, directly to his father's old study, the room he had avoided meaningfully entering for 12 years, and for the first time since Marcus Castellan's death. He opened every drawer, every locked cabinet he had inherited the keys to and never used, and read, methodically, by lamplight, through decades of his father's private correspondence. He found what he was looking for a little before dawn, a single letter, handwritten, unsent, dated 3 weeks after Etienne Broussard's death, addressed to no one, that Julien understood. Reading it, his father had likely written, and then never delivered to anyone at all, a private reckoning Marcus Castellan had apparently needed to put on paper and had then, for whatever reason, chosen to bury in a drawer instead of ever speaking aloud. Gideon acted alone that night. The letter read, in handwriting Julien recognized instantly from a childhood of report cards signed in the same hurried slant. Asterisk, I have told myself for 3 weeks that I would have stopped him if I had known in time, and I do not fully believe myself when I say it. I gave that man authority to protect this family by any means he judged necessary, and I have never once, in 12 years of his service, asked him to define the edges of that authority. A man is dead who should not be dead. A young widow believes it was an accident. I have chosen, God forgive me, to let her go on believing it, because the alternative, the true accounting of what this family is willing to do to protect itself, is more than I am willing to face in the daylight. I do not know what kind of man that makes me. I suspect I already do, and simply lack the courage to write it down. Julien sat alone in his father's study as the sun came up over the bayou, holding a letter that confirmed, in his father's own hand, everything Cammie had spent 8 weeks slowly uncovering, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that the enormous, quiet house he had spent his entire adult life trying to quietly reform had been built, in part, on a debt his family had never once acknowledged, let alone repaid. He called Cammie at 7 that morning. I found it, he said. My father knew. He knew, and he buried it, the same way Gideon buried it. And I have spent 12 years running this family without ever once asking what else might be sitting in a drawer somewhere, unaccounted for. He paused. I'm not going to bury this too. I need you to know that before anything else happens today. There was a long silence on the line before Cammie spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried something Julien hadn't expected, not relief exactly, and not vindication, but a kind of quiet, exhausted gratitude that surprised them both. Thank you, she said, for not needing more convincing than a letter and a memo. My mother spent 19 years believing that if the truth ever surfaced, this family would simply bury it a second time more carefully. I think some part of her still believes that, even now. Then I suppose I have more than one debt to pay off today, Julien said. Hers and yours and, honestly, my father's too. 12 years. Late. Gideon Marsh understood, by 9 that morning, that his 21 years of careful silence had finally, irreversibly run out. Julien had called him directly, asking him to come to the old family icehouse on the Bayou property, a disused cypress plank building from Marcus Castellan's grandfather's era, kept, mostly out of sentiment, at the far edge of the estate's back acreage, and something in the flat, formal tone of the request told Gideon, with absolute certainty, that this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. He went anyway. 22 years of loyalty to the Castellan name had taught him that running solved nothing a man in his position couldn't solve better by standing his ground and controlling the narrative in person, and some smaller, more honest part of him, the part that had lain awake more nights than he would ever admit to anyone, recognized that he was, in his own way, relieved the waiting was finally over. Julien was waiting for him inside the icehouse when he arrived, alone. His father's unsent letter in one hand and the incident report in the other. Cammy stood a short distance away, near the open door, close enough to hear everything, far enough that Julien had made clear, without needing to say it directly, that whatever happened in the next several minutes was not going to happen anywhere near her. Gideon looked at the two of them standing there, the man he had served for 22 years and the daughter of the man he had killed, and something in his face, for the first time in Cammy's brief acquaintance with him, looked less like careful calculation and more like simple, enormous tiredness. I assume, he said, we're past the point where I can talk my way out of whatever this is. We are, Julien said. I assume also, Gideon went on, that you already know most of it, or you wouldn't have chosen this particular building. My father-in-law used to store ice here, back when that was still a business. I've always thought it was a strange place for your family to keep for sentiment. Cold rooms don't usually hold good memories. I don't need you to talk about the building, Gideon. I need you to talk about my father's letter. Gideon nodded once, slowly, and something in his shoulders settled. The way a man's shoulders settle when a weight he has carried so long it became part of his posture is finally, however briefly, about to be set down. I read my father's letter, Julien said, without preamble. I know what you did. I know he knew, and I know he chose to let a widow raise a child believing a lie for 19 years rather than face what his own security chief had done in his name. I need you to tell me, honestly, one time, exactly what happened that night, not the version you've been telling yourself for 21 years to make it bearable. The truth. Gideon looked at him for a long moment, and something in his carefully controlled posture finally, visibly, gave way, not collapse exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man setting down a weight he had carried alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Etienne Broussard saw a shipment that shouldn't have existed, he said quietly. 11 seconds, on a camera he didn't know was there. I made a decision that night that I have told myself every single day since was the only decision available to a man in my position. I was wrong to tell myself that. I understood I was wrong within a week of doing it, and I have spent every year since finding new ways not to look at that understanding directly. He set something down on the old wooden counter between them, a small, worn notebook, 21 years old, that Julien had never known existed. It's all in there. Every detail. I never let myself write anywhere your father could find it. I kept it. Anyway, I don't fully understand why, except that some part of me always knew this morning was eventually going to come, and I think I wanted there to be a true record waiting when it did. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not run. He stood in the old Cypress ice house where his employer's grandfather had once stored ice for a dying industry, and he simply, finally, after 21 years, told the whole truth in order while Camille Broussard stood in the doorway and listened to the exact shape of the 11 seconds that had defined her entire life without her ever knowing it. What happens now, Gideon said, when he had finished, is entirely yours to decide, Julien. I won't fight it. I've had 21 years to imagine every version of this morning, and I find I'm mostly relieved. It's finally the real one. Julien was quiet for a long moment, looking at the notebook, at the letter in his own hand, at Camille standing framed in the open doorway, with the bayou light behind her. You're going to turn yourself in, he said finally. Today. With a lawyer, with this notebook, with my father's letter, and with my full public statement that Castellan Maritime failed a family under our protection for 21 years and is not going to fail them a 22nd. He set the incident report down beside the notebook. I'm not going to have you killed in an ice house, Gideon, whatever you might have expected walking in here. That was my father's kind of justice, and my father's kind of justice is exactly what buried this. In the first place, you're going to face what actually happened in daylight in a courtroom where a family that's owed a debt this large can finally see it paid in something other than silence. Gideon Marsh was arraigned 6 weeks later on charges connected to Etienne Broussard's death, supported by his own handwritten notebook, the incident report Camille had found, and Marcus Castellan's unsent letter, which Julien released in full alongside a public statement, acknowledging his family's decades-long failure to account for what had happened at their own docks. It cost Castellan Maritime a portion of its carefully maintained public reputation. Julien paid that cost without hesitation, in the same plain, unhurried way he had once crossed a dining room for a woman whose name he hadn't previously known. Odette Broussard, fully recovered, did not return to housekeeping. At Julien's insistence, offered, this time, with no ambiguity about what it was or wasn't, the family established a permanent trust in Etienne's name, administered independently, its first act funding Camille's remaining years of nursing school in full and establishing a scholarship, awarded every year afterward, for the children of Port of New Orleans dock workers. Odette accepted none of it easily. She had spent 19 years building a life around silence so complete she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to speak the true story of her own husband's death out loud, and it took her, by her own account, most of a year to stop flinching every time someone said Etienne's name in a room that wasn't just the two, now 3 of them. I kept it from you because I thought I was protecting you, she told Camille one evening, months later, sitting on the porch of the small shotgun house on Bayou Terrebonne Julien had helped them move into, close enough to the water that you could hear it at night. I didn't understand until you walked into that man's dining room and did the one thing I never let myself do in 19 years, that the silence wasn't protecting either of us anymore. It was just keeping us small. You kept us alive, Camille said. That's not nothing, Mama. That's not small at all. The trial itself, when it finally came, 10 months later, was mercifully brief. Gideon Marsh pled guilty to every charge his own notebook supported, offered no defense beyond a full, unflinching account of that October night, and asked, in his single statement to the court, that whatever sentence he received be understood not as punishment for a moment of panic, but for 21 years of choosing, every single day, not to correct it when he still could have. Odette attended every day of the brief proceeding. Cammy sat beside her every time. Neither of them ever spoke to Gideon directly again, though Cammy would say, years later, that the strangest part of the entire ordeal was the small, unexpected mercy of watching a man finally run out of places to hide from what he'd done and finding in that something closer to peace than she'd expected to feel. Julien Castellan finished, over the following 2 years, the slow unwinding of the last of his father's old arrangements, a project that had once felt to him like an impossible inheritance to carry alone, and that felt now, with a housekeeper's daughter as an unlikely and permanent fixture in his life's slower, honest corners, considerably less impossible than it once had. He never fully explained, even to himself, exactly what Cammy Broussard had become to him over those 2 years. Not an employee, not quite anything either of them had a tidy word for, only someone whose presence had, somehow, without either of them planning it, become essential to the kind of man he wanted to finish becoming. One evening, more than a year after the ice house, he found her again in his father's old study, now converted, at her suggestion, into a small public archive documenting the port's labor history. Etienne Broussard's photograph, the real one, finally framed and hung on the wall among dozens of others. "You know," he said, "there was a rule in this house for 19 years that you broke exactly once. I remember. I had it removed. Officially. Last month." He almost smiled. "Turns out the most important thing that ever happened in this family started because somebody finally didn't follow it. And here, dear friends, is where this story leaves us. The most dangerous silences are rarely the loud ones. They're the quiet, patient kind, the ones a family learns to live inside for so many years that the silence itself starts to feel like safety right up until the moment someone young enough and honest enough and desperate enough refuses to stay quiet any longer. A maid's daughter broke the only rule that had ever stood between her family and the truth, and in doing that one small, unspectacular thing, she didn't just save her mother's life. She finally brought a 21-year-old debt home to be paid. So tell me, has a truth you weren't supposed to go looking forever changed the whole shape of your family's story once you finally found it? Share it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to know what's sitting in your heart tonight. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so more stories like it find their way to you. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I wish you truth, courage, and peace tonight and every night after this one.